Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this book by Conrad Riker, The Essential Roles of Men. And I know this is going to be really interesting to you, especially as you mentioned you're part of the married red pill community. So,
Yeah, absolutely. This book, it really digs into a lot of things that you're probably already familiar with, like, um, hypergamy, toxic feminism, the whole red pill philosophy.
right. And for you specifically, I know you're really interested in the idea of covert contracts within marriage
Yeah.
and how those play out. So I think this book is going to be especially relevant.
Yeah, I mean, Raker really gets into like the history of it all too. He makes the argument that like you can't really understand the complexities of like modern relationships today unless you understand like the fundamental roles that men have played throughout history.
Okay, so let's kind of start there then. In those early chapters, he really digs into the evolutionary basis of gender roles, right?
Yeah.
He's claiming that men, because of their physical strength and their evolutionary history, are just naturally predisposed to take on these roles of protection and provision.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to compare it to the animal kingdom. Like he looks
Hmm.
at all these different species and how they've developed these different gender roles, and he emphasizes that they're different, yeah, but they're actually complementary. It's like this whole push for equality is kind of ignoring these basic biological and evolutionary blueprints that have been in place for like millennia.
I see. So he's setting the stage by saying, like, hey, men and women have distinct roles that have developed over, thousands and thousands of years. But then how does he connect that to the idea of these covert contracts in marriage, which I know is a big concern for you?
Well, that's where his critique of toxic feminism comes in. In later chapters, he really goes after the feminist movement, and he argues that rather than seeking equality, it's actually trying to dismantle traditional masculinity and establish like female dominance. And he says this directly impacts the covert contracts within a marriage because as society shifts away from those traditional roles, the expectations within the marriage change too.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words there. And for our listener who's deep in the red pill world, this is probably aligning with a lot of what they already believe about the current, social climate. But like, what evidence does he present to support these claims?
He points to a lot of things. For instance, like the rise of no-fault divorce. He argues that Camille has disproportionately benefited women. He also looks at legal precedents, like in child custody cases. He claims that the courts often favor mothers, regardless of like the father's involvement or his fitness as a parent.
So he's saying that these legal frameworks, rather than promoting fairness, are actually contributing to an imbalance of power within the marriage. And that leads to these unspoken covert contracts being broken or exploited.
Exactly. And this is where he brings in the concept of hypergamy, which I know is a hot topic in the red pill community. He suggests that women are just biologically wired to seek partners of higher status and resources. And he believes this, coupled with all of these legal and social changes he's outlined, creates a situation where men are at a disadvantage in modern relationships, especially marriage.
Now, I know hypergamy is a big discussion point in the red pill community, but I'm curious, does he offer any solutions or strategies for men who are already in a marriage and are dealing with these potentially, imbalanced covert contracts?
Yeah, he does touch upon that. He suggests that men need to become more aware of their own value and their contributions to the relationship. He encourages men to be more assertive, to set clear boundaries, and to not be afraid to renegotiate those unspoken agreements within the marriage. He even suggests that in some cases, alternatives to traditional marriage, like cohabitation or legal partnerships, might be a safer route for men, although I know that's not really your focus today.
Interesting. So he's saying that men need to wake up to these realities and take some proactive steps to protect themselves. I sense a connection here to the whole red pill analogy. Am I right?
Absolutely. In a later chapter, he describes taking the red pill as like waking up to the truth about gender dynamics and societal manipulation. He sees it as the first step towards dismantling these societal structures that work against men, particularly within marriage. And this ties directly back to your interest in amending covert contracts. He argues that understanding the red pill philosophy is crucial to recognizing those unfair agreements in the first place.
It sounds like he's providing a framework for men to analyze their own situations and potentially make some changes. But he also talks about the backlash that men face when they adopt this red pill perspective, right?
He does. In fact, he uses the backlash as further evidence of what he sees as a societal conspiracy to silence men who challenge the prevailing narrative.
That's a pretty bold statement. It seems like he's really trying to validate the experiences of men who feel like they're being marginalized or dismissed by society. And this actually leads perfectly into the next section of the book where he discusses the whole war on boys.
Yeah.
But we'll dive into that right after a quick break.
So before the break, we were talking about that red pill concept, right? And how it connects to the idea of covert contracts in marriage. And Riker takes that idea even further. He says it's not just affecting men's relationships, it's actually impacting boys from a very young age.
Right. He dedicates a big chunk of the book to this idea of a war on boys. Yeah. And the feminization of society. And I know this is something that resonates with a lot of guys, especially those in the red pill community who feel like traditional masculinity is under attack.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he doesn't just like make these broad statements, He actually backs up his claims with some pretty specific examples. He starts with the education system and argues that it's become increasingly hostile towards boys.
So how does he support that? What kind of evidence does he use?
Well, he points to a few things. For example, he cites these statistics that show boys are falling behind girls in school, in terms of grades and graduation rates. And he also argues that the way we discipline boys, it's like we're pathologizing their natural energy and competitiveness, and it's setting them up for failure.
So he's saying that the system itself is kind of designed in a way that disadvantages boys.
Right, exactly. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about how this war on boys extends beyond the classroom. He says the media constantly portrays men in a negative light. They're often depicted as bumbling, incompetent, or even dangerous.
It's like boys are getting bombarded with these messages that their masculinity is something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated.
Exactly. And he believes this has serious consequences later in life when these boys grow up to be men. They struggle to find their place in a world that seems to devalue their unique qualities and contributions.
Right. It's like they're being told that who they are is inherently wrong.
Yeah.
But for our listener who's married, how does Riker connect this back to relationships, specifically to their own marriage?
Well, that's where his analysis of the legal system comes in. He argues that the legal system is inherently biased against men, especially when it comes to family law. He uses examples of divorce settlements and child custody cases where men are often treated unfairly.
So even when a man enters into a marriage with good intentions, the system that's supposed to be about fairness and justice can actually work against him. Especially if that marriage ends in divorce.
Exactly. And he ties this back to the idea of covert contracts by saying that these legal biases basically force men into agreeing to these unspoken terms within their marriages, terms that might not actually be in their best interest.
It sounds like he's painting a pretty bleak picture for men in terms of both their societal standing and their personal relationships. But does he offer any solutions? Does he give any guidance for how to navigate these challenges?
He does. In fact, he dedicates a whole chapter to the MGTOW phenomenon, men going their own way. And he presents it as a radical but potentially liberating option for men who are just disillusioned with marriage relationships and the expectations that society puts on them.
Now, MGTOW is a pretty controversial topic even within the red pill community. Some see it as a necessary response to this war on men, while others think it's an extreme and unproductive approach. How does Riker present it?
He's careful not to endorse it outright, He acknowledges that it's not the right path for every man. But he does present it as a valid choice for those who feel like they've tried everything else. He argues that MGTOW can be a way for men to reclaim their power, focus on self-improvement, and find fulfillment outside of those traditional structures.
So he's not necessarily saying abandon relationships altogether, but he is saying men need to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of entering into those relationships, given the current social and legal climate.
Right. He's urging men to be aware of the potential pitfalls and to make informed decisions based on their own individual needs and desires.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something else that Riker mentions that I know will resonate with our listeners. He talks about the workplace and what he calls the feminist invasion of this traditionally male-dominated space. He seems especially concerned with how this impacts men's careers and their sense of purpose.
Yeah, this ties back into his whole argument about the erosion of traditional masculinity. He's saying that the workplace, which was once a place where men could assert their strength and leadership, has become increasingly feminized. There's this big focus on collaboration, empathy, and emotional intelligence.
And those are qualities that are typically associated with feminine traits.
Right. And Riker argues that this shift, while it's presented as a positive step towards equality, it actually disadvantages men who may not naturally excel in those areas or who feel like their more masculine attributes are being devalued.
He even says there's a new glass ceiling for men, where they're being passed over for promotions in favor of women, even when they're equally or more qualified.
That's right. And he points to things like quotas and affirmative action policies as evidence of this systemic bias against men in the workplace. He says these policies, while intended to create a more level playing field, are actually giving women an unfair advantage at the expense of men.
That's a pretty bold statement, and one that I'm sure will generate some debate. But for our listener who is already familiar with these red pill concepts, it probably just reinforces what they've already observed and
I
experienced.
would agree. And it's important to note that Riker isn't saying women shouldn't be in the workplace or that they shouldn't be successful. His point is more about fairness and balance. He believes that men and women have different strengths and weaknesses, and the workplace should value and reward those differences rather than trying to erase them.
So what does he suggest men do about it? How do they navigate this new workplace and still reach their goals?
He has a couple suggestions. He encourages men to focus on developing their own unique skills and talents, even if those skills don't fit the traditional mold of masculinity. He also advises men to seek out mentors, particularly older men who have successfully navigated these changes.
And he emphasizes the importance of networking and building strong relationships with other men, both inside and outside the workplace.
Right, it's about creating a support system, finding strength and solidarity with other men who are going through the same thing.
Now, Riker also spends a lot of time discussing the legal system and how it relates to marriage. And this is a key part of his argument, especially for our listener who's really focused on understanding and amending their own covert contract. So let's get into that. What are some of the specific examples he gives to support this idea that the legal system is biased against men?
Well, he starts with the whole concept of no-fault divorce. He says it's made it way too easy for women to initiate divorce, often with little regard for the husband's well-being. It puts men at risk of losing their families and their assets, even if they've been good partners.
And he also takes issue with how child custody is handled. He argues that the courts tend to favor mothers even when the father is equally capable of caring for the children.
Yeah, he brings up statistics showing that fathers are far less likely to be awarded primary custody, even if they've been actively involved. He sees this as a clear example of the legal system putting the mother's rights above the father's, even when it may not be the best thing for the kids.
So basically he's saying the system itself is set up to favor women at the expense of men.
That's how he sees it. And he believes this creates a power imbalance within the marriage, which can leave men vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation, especially when it comes to the unspoken terms of the covert contract.
For our listener who's already worried about these covert contracts, this part of the book is probably really eye-opening. It validates their concerns and gives them a framework for understanding the system they're dealing with.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember, Riker doesn't just present this information to make men feel hopeless. He also offers some practical advice for protecting themselves.
What kind of advice does he give?
He strongly encourages men to think about prenuptial agreements as a way to protect their assets if there is a divorce. He also advises men to be more assertive in setting boundaries within their marriages, to be clear about their needs and expectations, and to not be afraid to seek legal counsel if they feel like their rights are being violated.
So he's advocating for a more proactive approach to marriage, given the current climate.
Exactly. He wants men to be aware of the potential risks and to take steps to mitigate those risks rather than just hoping for the best. Knowledge is power, and by understanding the system, men can make informed decisions that protect their own interests.
That's a powerful message and one that I think will resonate with our listeners who are on this journey of self-discovery and empowerment. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to remind everyone that this has just been a glimpse into the essential roles of men. There's so much more in this book that we haven't even touched on.
If you're interested in exploring Riker's roadmap for reclaiming masculinity, I definitely recommend checking out the book for yourself. You can find it on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dives. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to be the best version of yourselves. Welcome back. So we've been talking about how Riker presents this idea that the traditional roles of men have been kind of eroded in modern society. And this has led to this sense of, displacement and maybe even a power imbalance, especially within marriage. Now, I'm curious, as we get to the end of the book, does he offer any hope? Like, does he propose a way forward for men who are feeling lost?
He does, and this is where I think the book gets really interesting. It would be easy to just lay out all these problems and leave men feeling defeated. But Riker actually ends on a pretty empowering note. He offers this roadmap for men to reclaim their masculinity and find fulfillment in a world that often seems like it's working against them.
Okay, so what does that look like? What steps does he suggest men take?
Well, it starts with self-awareness. He
Yeah.
encourages men to really take a look at their own lives, their beliefs, their behaviors,
Yeah.
and to identify places where they might have bought into these societal narratives that are actually harmful to them.
So it's about recognizing those covert contracts, not just in marriage, but in all areas of life, and then making a choice to renegotiate those terms.
Exactly. It's about taking control of your own life and not just being a passive participant in a system that might not have your best interests at heart.
I like that. It's about empowerment, not victimhood. But he goes beyond just self-reflection.
Right.
He gives some practical strategies, too.
Right, he does. For example, he talks about the importance of physical fitness and self-discipline. He says men need to cultivate their strength and resilience, not just for practical reasons, but also as a way to connect with that primal masculinity and boost their confidence.
He also talks about brotherhood, right? Like the importance of men connecting with and supporting each other.
Yeah, he sees that as essential.
Right.
He thinks men need to create their own tribes, these spaces where they can share their experiences, offer advice, and hold each other accountable.
It's like creating a counterculture, a force that pushes back against what society is telling men.
Exactly, and ultimately I think that's his message of hope. Even though the world may not always be friendly to traditional masculinity, men still have the power to create the life they want.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And I think it's one that will resonate with our listeners who are already on that path. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to remind everyone that this was just a taste of the essential roles of men. There's so much more in there.
If you're interested in learning more about Riker's ideas and his plan for reclaiming masculinity, I definitely recommend picking up the book. You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.